Thank you very much. I just want to say a big thanks to the whole creative industries team, Miriam and Maya and everybody else who's been involved in the festival. It's a very exciting festival every year, and we're always great to be for the Poetry Centre to be part of that. My name's Niall Munro. I'm the director of the Poetry Centre here at Brookes, and I'm also nominally, I suppose, in charge of our press, Ignition Press. And it's really exciting to see so many people here. Thank you so much for coming. And very exciting to be able to involve both my colleague Claire Cox and Kim Dean, who's here. I'm just going to introduce them and then tell you a bit about what we're planning to do in this session. So I'll just introduce Kim first of all. Some of you will know Kim's work or perhaps what they've been publishing. But Kim is an award-winning writer based in Newcastle. Their pamphlet, which is called Dionysia, which was published by Verve Poetry Press last year. And they were selected by for the Nine Arches Primers scheme, which is a kind of a three poets kind of book they create every so often, which is a really prestigious thing in 2021. Their micro chapbook Fee Fi Fo Fum was published by Broken Sleep Books. Kim is, and this is largely, I guess, what we'll be talking about today, the founder, director, and editor of the Bragg CIC, which is a press journal and, they say, a trickster spirit that publishes poetry and speculative fiction while supporting emerging artists in the northeast of England. Kim's originally from Teesside, has been passionate about arts in the north since becoming a member of the Writing Squad's, which is a wonderful group, the Writing Squad's mentorship scheme in 2016. They're also a member of the Tees Women Poets and co-founder of the Durham University Slam team. And then Claire is colleague at Brookes, born in Hong Kong. Claire is a PhD from Royal Holloway University of London and an MA in creative writing from Oxford Brookes University, a very fine institution, where she was awarded the Blackwell's Prize for Best Student. Her poetry, or her book about poetry and disaster, is something she's working on at the moment. Emerging from the PhD is forthcoming from Palgrave, so we're excited to see that. She's also obviously the co-founder and associate editor of Ignition Press here at Brookes, and her works have appeared in various magazines, including also Primers Volume 5, published by Nine Arches. Claire also won the Wigtown Alistair Reid Pamphlet Prize with her collection A Book of Days in 2020, and I'll post some of that when I get a minute. I'll post some of that in the chat. So our plan is to talk a little bit about pamphlets, first of all. We're not presuming that everybody knows what a pamphlet is. We have many, many examples on my desk and everybody else has examples. Kim was just showing us this gigantic bag of pamphlets that they have. So we might delve into that a bit later on as well. So we just want to talk a bit about, what the pamphlet is for us. And why we like them, why we think they're particularly exciting forms. Some of you may well, published in pamphlets. Maybe you have lots of copies of pamphlets. Maybe you've never seen a pamphlet before. So we'll try and uncover that a little bit. And then think a bit about what the vision for our respective organisations has been for the Bragg and for Ignition Press. But the Bragg also does a lot of other, we exclusively do pamphlets at Ignition Press, but the Bragg does a whole bunch of other things which are really exciting. Microjournal, thinks about location as well in the north and northeast. So we're going to talk sort of more broadly as well with Kim about what wider cultural industries intersect with what the Bragg and Kim have been doing. So let's just kick off by talking a bit about what the pamphlet is. So there are lots of different ways of kind of thinking about pamphlets. Let me just show you a couple of examples that I've got. So this is one published by Hercules edition, some of you will know. This is a very interesting, very small square pamphlet, but sort of combines both text by Helen Mort. It's called The Singing Glacier. And also, there's also quite a lot of images in here of or relating to kind of glacial landscapes. And it's a sort of collaboration then with an artist called Emma Stibborn. And there's also sort of comments in here about sort of from filmmakers. And also there's some criticism at the back by David Cooper, who's an academic, talking about geography and place and so on and how that intersects with poetry. So that's one kind of example on one side. And yet you also get sort of very, very sort of small pieces like this. This is the Tricolor textbook by a poet called Wendy Allen, who actually graduated from our MA quite recently. And this is called, it's published by Broken Sleep. It's called A Legitimate Snack because it is so tiny. I'm quite sure why it's so legitimate. But anyway, it has its own little page at the back telling you there's only 40 copies of it. This is number 31, all numbered. So it's almost like a sort of art book in that kind of respect, and has these rather beautiful sort of end papers as well. So that's just a couple of examples of the kinds of things you can do, quite different from each other in terms of pamphlets. I wonder, Kim, if you've got any kind of particularly interesting ideas of how you would define a pamphlet, maybe. What do you think a pamphlet is, and what can it do?
So when I'm thinking about pamphlets, just in terms of, writers looking to publish a pamphlet, I generally say, look, let's begin by saying it is a collection of poems, normally under 40 pages. And that definition there in its simplest form has just come about because of prizes and prize categories. When you actually look at American pamphlets, a lot of them are quite longer. So like Reconstructions by Bradley Trumpfeller, this is a sibling rivalry press book that actually goes into 50 pages and would be considered a collection in the UK, but is very much sold as a pamphlet in the US. So even that definition is not hard and fast. Um, I like to see a pamphlet as a kind of little gasp of poetry. We're looking at maybe even as short as 15 to 20 pages. A legitimate snack is often just 9 pages of poetry, as are our micro chapbooks. But what you're looking at for me is an idea that is explored over that kind of, yeah, that little gasp of poetry. And it's something that I think poetry really excels in the small formats, because it's such a thin medium a lot of the time. And I think that so much of the time you can actually, not only do you find a wider variety and more experimental poetry in pamphlets than you do in traditionally published collections, sometimes you find stuff that can really only exist in the pamphlet form because there's no way to sustain it in a 60, 80 page collection. So you can get really unusual concepts and ideas explored. So
That's great. That's a terrific definition way of exploring. I mean, you're right. It's one of the major competitions, or one of the few, I suppose, pamphlet competitions, is the Michael Marks competition, and that demands that you have 36 pages. You can't have anything longer than 36 pages. There was actually quite an interesting debate recently. I think it was the Elliot Prize, T.S. Eliot Prize, when some of you will know one of the major prizes in the UK. And it turned out that erroneously, two collections which had been shortlisted for the prize were under the usual length for a quote unquote book length collection. So there was a bit of debate about that and how they slipped through the net. But those could almost have been considered kind of pamphlet length rather than kind of collection length. So there is, as you say, there's a lot of kind of flexibility and kind of blurring of boundaries, really. But yeah, a lot of the time in the UK, the pamphlet is seen as being somewhere around 36 pages. In America, sometimes people call it a chapbook as opposed to a pamphlet. We were at a poetry book fair just at the weekend, and somebody came up to me, he was a South African poet actually, and said, "I don't like this word pamphlet. It sounds very insignificant. It sounds like the sort of thing somebody would stick on your car windscreen or something." And of course, originally, that's where this idea came from, that kind of political pamphlet. And some of those have been tremendously influential. We think about Thomas Paine writing political pamphlets. But the chapbook is the thing which I guess for him sounded more like a book. So it somehow had more kind of heft behind it. I don't agree with that at all. But anyway, that's one perspective. Claire, what else do you think, the pamphlet does that's maybe different from, book length collections?
Listening in very intently here. It's all good stuff. The pamphlet, I'm glad you've clarified the pamphlet chapbook thing, because sometimes people can get a bit stuck on what's what. I guess that's mainly kind of regional definitions. The pamphlet, I get really excited about pamphlets because it's exactly what Kim was saying. It's if you like poetry and it's a compressed form, and you believe that poetry can, in a very intensive way, say what it needs to say, then why spin it out over 60 pages when actually you've created the world, you've made your point, you've created your ambiguity or whatever it is, or you're leaving something very surreal that's hanging there that isn't resolved. All those possibilities happen in the world of universe of pamphlet, I think. And it's tiny, but it has a kind of infinity about it that I'm incredibly drawn to. I think, and I also think as a practicing poet, it's a way of, it's a form that's really useful. It's not quite as ta-da as a collection, my collection, I say this having not done a collection, but having lots of stuff in my computer files that could be a collection. So, but it seems it's much more compressed area to explore things. The other thought I did have, because we seem to have gone straight into the press thing, is and it's a provocation really, is could a pamphlet exist in digital form? Do they exist in digital forms, or are my part of my attraction is the physicality of it, that you can actually encompass things in your hand. I've got a tiny little chapbook here, and a very beautifully produced one here that all counts as pamphlets. Should we discuss the sort of physical form as well as something without as part of its definition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So maybe if maybe we can pull out some other examples. So do you want to maybe tell us, Claire, about those ones that you've got there? What those are? What you think are interesting about those particular pamphlets? And I'm sure Kim's got
like you
plenty
said
of
in our
examples.
preamble, we were sort of doing like competitive pamphlet producing out of the hat. What I've found some that I think give a sort of a feel of the range of what a pamphlet chapbook could be. There's the lovely enclosures by our friend and colleague Susie Campbell, which is, and then you get into all this kind of physical stuff. It's stitched on the spine, and it's also kind of text set within text. So as you say, that's the kind of, and beautifully feel, that's the kind of art book. And again, the lovely Guillemot press do exquisitely beautiful objects, really. There's I don't know if you can see, but there's a sort of erasure poem that's printed on semi-transparent paper as well. So as artifacts, they're very beautiful. There's this one by Oystercatcher Press, incredibly simple, just staple, saddle stitch, staple stitched. Oopsie, don't have something in it. But in itself, just it has the space and the refreshingness, and it's a lovely thing in itself, even more, though quite simple. And then this one from Wesleyan University Press, which has got a spine which has got the, oh, I'm not pointing at the right thing, am I? With the, even this tiny thing has got the spine with the title. Oh no, it hasn't. Yes, it has. It's got the press thing on it, and it declares itself a Wesleyan chapbook. And then it's got some very devil-may-care font there. Look at that. Look at that. So and actually the author sidesteps the whole thing and just calls it This Little Book. So yeah, it's a little book for there. So as I say, that for me seem to be a sort of sample of where it could go, and nothing's really excluded, I don't think.
No, that's great. Thank you. Those are really interesting examples. I mean, I think that one of the things you're drawing attention to there is the fact that they are sometimes kind of art objects. They are kind of art cultural artifacts that people can appreciate the kind of aesthetic of them, and in terms of things like the paper quality. And indeed, if you look at the back of the legitimate snack one, for example, they actually list not just what the font is, which is quite common, but also what the end papers are called, what the title, how it's set, what it's set in, what kind of fonts have been used. Those kind of things. There's a real attention to detail, perhaps, that you can't get quite so much with a kind of book length thing some of the time. Kim, what kind of examples have you got to show us?
So I just want to say that the pamphlet can exist in many different forms that isn't just poetry. This is one of my favorite pamphlets in the entire world, and it is 15-second plays by Ugly Duckling Press, which is an American press. And they do a lot of unusual things. This is just a standard staple bound with card, and then just kind of very standard print in, although again, it is 15-second plays, which is really quite a wonderful format. This is also not by a single author. This is a sort of anthology experimental pamphlet situation. There's another one by Ugly Duckling, which has that lovely traditional binding. You can see that just does two lots of string. So that's been hand bound. You can't do that on a machine. When you get to some Hazel Press books, they've been machine stitched along the back. So you get some really lovely different kinds of bindings. I have another Ugly Duckling book, which is Gone Walkabout, where it's split in the middle, and on one side is the Czech poems, because they're multi-language, and on one side is the English, and they're bound almost in two books that meet in the middle, which just shows how much space you can have Here's a tiny one by Knives, Forks and Spoons with a proper spine, and it's got kind of illustrations and colour throughout, which is looks lovely when I flick through it. So yeah, again, with that kind of art book, the ability to move about form, the ability to kind of be very experimental, and that opportunity for cross arts. And very quickly, finally, I have a Smith doorstop book from 1987, which is an old Ian Macmillan and Martin Wiley pamphlet, which just splits in the middle with a bright yellow page and goes from one book to the other. And it's all typeset in that traditional typewriter font. So I think that just gives you an idea that this is a form that has been going on and experimenting for a very long time.
That one's probably worth quite a lot of money, Kim. I keep holding that one. That's really amazing.
Yep, it's still got the original £1.25 price tag on.
Not worth that anymore. Wow, that's not quite an antique. I'm sure Ian McMillan would be very.
No, I should get him to sign it though. I think I should take it round and just.
It could have probably fairly local to you, yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Those are great examples. I mean, well, the other thing I was going to say about pamphlets as well is that the authors themselves can be quite different. So it's quite interesting just to kind of think about. I mean, obviously with Ignition Press, we'll get onto this in a second, but we work exclusively really with emerging writers, so people who probably haven't, by and large, haven't published a pamphlet or anything, book length before, whereas Kim works with all kinds of different writers. And it's also true to say that sometimes poets who are much more established will pick a pamphlet and say, okay, I've got this sequence of poems or this whole bunch of poems that they don't seem to fit anywhere else. The pamphlet seems like a perfect place to, as Claire was saying earlier, kind of have this kind of sustained engagement with an idea. So here's just an example of that. So David Harson, some of you will know David Harson's work, very well known and multi-award winning poet based in the UK. But this is a pamphlet that he did back, I think, in the 1970s, 1973. And it is very simple. It is just kind of stitched together on the sides. We're talking about stitching, and has some very sort of straightforward text. And I think there's only about there's about sort of 20 pages here. And again, limited edition, 200 copies, actually printed in Oxford by a press called Sycamore Press. So that kind of thing is also very possible. It isn't necessarily just emerging writers, and it isn't necessarily poets who are kind of getting their start in poetry making who necessarily will publish pamphlets. And I'm sure other people will be able to think of some other really good examples. Is there anything else that you think the pamphlet does which is maybe different, that maybe is a kind of unique and important thing that the pamphlet does? So I'm trespassing on one of your questions, Claire, here. But anything else which you think the pamphlet does which is maybe different to a kind of book?
I do think that you can do a lot more experimenting with form, because it's not something that necessarily has to sustain itself over the length of a book, where you might want larger arcs, you might want even something really experimental, you might even want kind of more of a plot. In the same way that short stories are a different beast to a novel, in the same way that short stories can move in different ways. For instance, when I was writing my book Dionysia, well, my pamphlet Dionysia, there was a lot of inspiration from Greek theatre tradition in that, and a lot of it was set out in a sort of pseudo theatrical format, which was something that I really would have struggled with over a collection. People kept saying, oh, why isn't it longer? It's like, it doesn't have to be longer. It shouldn't be longer. The reason why you're coming away from it and going, oh, I love that, like, I wanted more of it, is because it was the right length for what it needed to be.
Thank you. I was also just again testing the assumptions that one of the reasons why I really like pamphlets is not only can you work with the form of the poem within the poem, but then there's that other slightly addictive thing of how one then sets poems against poems within a pamphlet, and all sorts of amazing things can happen, and different things can click off. And so I'm also just going to ask, is there an assumption that a pamphlet is thematically a whole, or can we have a pamphlet that's different poems, or is it, I'm sort of asking the wrong question, because as I say, part of my addiction is to make something bigger from lots of little things, and for it to chime. But I'm sure that can happen with poems that were written separately. Do As part of your practice, Kim, do you look at things like that?
So a lot of people ask me when they're putting together a pamphlet, because I do a lot of writing mentoring in my other job, kind of, does it have to be connected? And the answer is no, it doesn't have to be connected. But I would say that in terms of what's getting published, the pattern and the kind of the readership and seems to be going towards collections that are more strongly themed, and kind of have that idea. And I think it can sometimes make you work a little bit harder, which is normally a good thing. But sometimes, but also even if you're writing stuff that's quite disconnected from itself, you might look at it when you put it together, and connections often form anyway. Somebody in the chat has just asked, how does a pamphlet differ from a novella? A novella is obvious. Well, you've got that prose normally in a novella. You normally have a beginning, an end. You will have some kind of traditional prose structure in a novella. I've written a novella that I'm probably never going to do anything with because I got really scared of it. But that was very much thinking about arc and character and kind of those traditional prose structures that make up either, yeah, like a novella or a novel, or even short stories to an extent. Whereas a pamphlet is normally sequences of poems. The structure is normally a lot more fluid, a lot more experimental, and it's generally poetry. When I've published prose pamphlets, they've generally not been a single novella, but been individual flash fictions mixed with some short stories, kind of orbiting around a central concern.
Yes, that's great answer. Thanks very much, Kim. Yeah, I of course I'm going to show you a prose pamphlet now. So just to kind of, but there obviously are, as you already said, and when you're talking about kind of micro chapbooks and things, a lot of the time that can be flash fiction or can be prose. So this is a piece by Nancy Campbell called "Death of a Foster Son," which is prose, is kind of about kind of experiences of kind of, I think this is the Icelandic stories she's very interested in. So you can see there, it's actually really beautifully put together. There's both sort of regular text up here and some in italics and a different sort of larger blue font. And yes, it also has some imagery in it as well. So it's illustrated as well as having prose. It's really fantastic. So that again would be, I suppose it's, limited edition sort of art object very much. But that's a prose example. But it is quite small. I mean, it's only very thin. So it isn't something like on the scale of a novella or even a short story, perhaps. It just has these kind of episodic kind of quality, not unlike, I suppose, a sequence of poems. Just before we get to thinking about some of the kind of philosophies, I suppose, between the two sort of presses that we have, I wonder if there were any other particular pamphlets you wanted to draw attention to, because I asked Claire and Kim just to think, I mean, maybe they've done it already, but to think about if there are any particular pamphlets they thought they've been very excited by, not counting their own, I suppose, not counting their own pamphlets or ones they publish. I'll just kick off with one here. So this is Into the Same Sound Twice by Zakia Carpenter Hall, which is published by Seren just last year, actually. And this is a really exciting one because I think it does the sort of stuff which I think pamphlets can do. Sometimes people don't necessarily think pamphlets have a great deal of scope. They go, well, it's only 36 pages in total. There's maybe 20 something poems in those 36 pages. It can't be terribly ambitious. It's maybe a kind of greatest hits of what an emerging poet has so far. And I think sometimes that can be the case, but sometimes I think that can be quite misleading. The wonderful thing, or one of the wonderful things about this pamphlet, is it is very ambitious. There's all kinds of types of poems in here. In terms of form, you have some prose poems like this one. You have some poems in which Zakia has kind of created a whole sequence of poems. The Earth-Eating Fire, which is about forest fires across the world. You have some really sort of long poems that kind of spread right the way down the page and have these really interesting kind of couplet forms. So in terms of form, in terms of the themes that are being discussed in here, it deals a lot with kind of time and space and environments and bodies. It's really powerful, and it is all happening in 36 pages. So I think that's one of the things that people don't necessarily think about when they think about pamphlets, that kind of great ambitious scope and very complicated and complex nature that a sort of shorter collection like this can put together. So Kim, Claire, I wonder if you have any that you wanted to kind of just spotlight.
I literally found this in a charity shop. It came out in 2021 and it's by Rattle. It's an American pamphlet. It's called A Plumber's Guide to Light. And it is one of the books that I give to people when they go, I don't like poetry, I don't do this, because it is very much about it's written by a plumber who is also an amazing poet, and it's a lot of it is about plumbing, which shouldn't be as astonishingly beautiful as it is, but it really, really works. And it's one of those really unexpected books that I never thought. I picked it up on a whim, and it turned out to be absolutely stunning.
That is fantastic. That's such a great example. Just before Claire gives us an example, Jacqueline's asking, is there a hard rule as to how long or short a pamphlet must be? Not really. I mean, it depends if you want to put it into a competition. So we were mentioning earlier the Michael Marks pamphlet competition. That one basically says you have to have a maximum of 36 pages. But quite a lot of other pamphlets are nowhere near that. They might be longer than that. They might be quite a bit, as Kim was saying earlier, quite a bit shorter than that. So it might just be determined by A, the publisher, and B, if it wants to be entered for competitions which demand a certain length. Kim, would you like to tell us a bit about what the vision for the Bragg has been? Because I mean, it's not been going, I guess, for that long. Why did you decide to kind of set it up, and what's the kind of rationale? Because you do lots of different things as part of that organisation.
Yeah, so I kind of realized during the pandemic that I really wanted to do something in the arts where I had kind of creative control. And we ran a few events over the pandemic, and we did some poetry murder mysteries, and I thought, actually, you know what? This has been really enjoyable, but I discovered my love of print mags and kind of reading, of like reading journals specifically over the pandemic, where I was going through a lot of backlog of online journals. And I thought, well, okay, we can definitely do a journal. But the kind of ethos of the Bragg is underlaid by the fact that I have chronic fatigue and I can't afford to pay anybody. So it has to be accessible for me to do without me losing my mind and my health. Hence, we set up the micro journal first. So and I'm a huge proponent of micro journals. That I feel like I'm one of the only few out there, but I really think there should be more space for them, because a micro journal can be run by one person. I have some guest readers, guest editors that come in and out, but it can be run by me. We publish 7 poets or like fiction writers every 3 months on a rolling submissions, and we love weird, wild fiction, so we have a really strong theme. We kind of only take a couple of submissions from writers. We don't take 5 or 6 poems. You can submit 2. That's your lot. And I think that I felt like there was a gap for a magazine that was publishing things that would count under that weird fiction and weird poetry umbrella, which is a sort of a bit of a vague genre, as a lot of genres are. But to kind of go, we like weird stuff and we're in the North, was not, I didn't see another organization doing that. So I thought that would be a good fit. And then I applied for a grant from New Writing North to go into publishing books, because I've noticed a lot of poetry pamphlet organizations go under over the last few years. It's been a really tough time for a lot of organizations, and I come from working with the Poetry Book Society, so I had a good idea of what all the margins and all the money had to look like to make it work. And I wanted to do something where we could publish really kind of tightly themed odd books that had a real life to them, and something that was maybe folkloric or ecological or just kind of odd. And the plan is to make sure that we're working with some Northern writers, but also accepting pamphlets really from everywhere in the UK. So we also accept micro chapbooks from across the world. So we've worked with a US author as well as 3 British ones. And basically because we don't have to do a book launch for those, and we don't have to do a book launch for anything, but I like doing book launches. I think they're fun. It's much easier to pay transport when somebody's based in the UK. It's a little bit more difficult to arrange a launch for somebody in America.
That's great. That's so interesting, actually, that you were talking about the economics of it. And obviously, you have all that expertise from working with the Poetry Book Society. That must have been tremendously useful, I suppose, because there is very much that kind of sense of how do we sustain this over a period of time. how are we actually able to keep it going and have that kind of obligation to poets that we are publishing or that we have published, we have back catalogue for, making sure that, if we run into trouble, we know how we're going to deal with them as authors. And as you say, there have been quite a few organisations and publishers which have disappeared, sadly, and magazines as well, actually, over the past kind of couple of years in particular. So the economics of it is something I think that we've had to kind of think about as a press as well. Are there any particular pamphlets that you'd like to kind of showcase from from the Brag? Maybe things, I know that you've published a few recently.
So we bring out 2 pamphlets a year. So 2 poetry and 1 prose a year, I should say. So we've just had the 2 poetry come out. So this is Pond by Sarah Westcott. It's about the languages of ponds and watching a pond grow over the course of the pandemic. It's very light and beautiful and kind of very, very much about how we speak to the non-human and whether or not the non-human can speak back to us. And then we have Gnotta by Nina Murray, which is an absolutely dense, folkloric, bloody book about this set of generations of Ukrainian women and their family history. And it's a little bit riffing off the life of Lesya Ukrainka, one of the famous feminist poet and thinker. But you don't need any background to come to this book. Yeah, it's very much fairy tale. So that's kind of, those are our 2 for this year, but we're opening again in summer for submissions.
That's great. I mean, that's another point maybe we can come to in a second. But just in terms of your design, how do you make that decision about? Because those covers are kind of, I suppose, there's a similarity, is there, in terms of font, even if the colours are quite different? Yeah. How do you come to that kind of decision?
For me, it was one of my co-workers at the Poetry Book Society left around the same time I did, and his design work. So he designs book covers as well, and we came to an agreement over the covers. And I also do some design work myself now, but because we had that look developed with our first prose pamphlet Unfurl, we've continued the design through. And Nathaniel was one of the writers of this, so he had a lot of input, which then helped us carry the design through.
Those are fantastic. There's a real, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? That kind of, in so much as we don't necessarily want to talk about branding, that there is a way in which that kind of integrity or that kind of signature style can be carried through. And this is something that maybe, Claire, I can ask you to talk about this, that we did with our press, Ignition Press, as well, in the sense that we kind of originally worked with a local designer here to Oxford, who has kind of built on that style over, we've now published 25 pamphlets. So that style has kind of continued all the way through. Thank you, Kim. That was really interesting, a little insight. We'll come back to maybe that question about kind of the micro things in a minute, because I'd like to know more about what the micro journal is and how micro it is. Claire, could you possibly speak to that idea of maybe where our press is kind of coming from, why we decided to kind of set it up, and maybe some of those design questions as well?
Yes, I think you and I were sitting in a poetry reading one time and just looked at each other and went, "Poetry Pamphlet Press, we know nothing. Les Robinson is over there, he knows something. Let's just do it." So yeah, it was completely seemed like a really good idea at the time, and we, as I say, we knew nothing about it. And it was I think it was interesting how we all kind of coalesced on the starting point. Again, somebody's there's a question about chapbooks and being a stepping stone, and we can talk about this later, the relative value, I guess, creatively and monetarily, between a pamphlet and a collection that might have some or a lot of the pamphlet in it. We can so I've registered that, and we can talk to that. But I think our sense was that it's an excellent stepping stone. We wanted it to be a physical thing and not a digital thing, and we wanted it to ignite so people's careers and also our excitement in poetry and the readers' excitement in poetry. So that's, I think, why we came around to sort of that sense of ignition press. I can't remember, there was a long list of possibles that we trawled through over coffee with several people. That's the one that made it. And so I think we tried to get the design that reflected that sense of spark. We started very much, oh, sorry, that's just snuck in there, that shouldn't be there. Spark, that kind of color, and then we ended up doing lots, so we went into different colorways, again using the same designer, and taking from we've collaborated with Les Robinson of Tall Lighthouse, and oh look at that, who was a very strong advocate of what people are going to get on the shelf. So he advertised the spine, said that it's got to stand out and it's got to be a known. So we've gone very much with that, you know, really easily identifiable, quite uniform in a way, look, which has served us well, I believe, and they do look like a stable, if you like, a press. So and then the sort of what goes in it, as I said, we wanted something that excited us, that we found fresh and we found interesting. And I'm deeply proud of the poets that we've worked with. They, you know, to each of them has got amazing sensibilities, amazing skills, is saying something that I want to read, and so I think it. So we did it because we wanted to. We are obliged to break even for university financial purposes, but a part of the business plan was that we will seek to break even, but this is not a money-making venture. We are looking at reputational and the launch pad for other poets. I think, is that fair, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the university doesn't fund us. We don't get money from the university. We originally actually started the press using money which we had got from our international poetry competition, which we used to run. We haven't run for a couple of years, but that's where the kind of seed funding effectively for the press came from. So it wasn't actually tied to the university in many ways. There is sort of university branding on the back. So if you look at the pamphlet, there is a kind of Oxford Brookes logo over here, but most of the time the university doesn't interfere with us. Sometimes we have to get approval. There was one pamphlet which had a swear word in the title, and we had to get that passed via the vice chancellor, who I think just kind of looked at it and said that's fine. And that was it. So that's pretty much the only time we've had sort of broad interaction with the kind of university hierarchy, I suppose. Yes, that's great, Claire. Thank you very much. I mean, I think that it's also maybe worth saying that some of the stuff we do in terms of, and I'm sure Kim does this as well, with the poets themselves, it's quite a lot of mentoring, I suppose, or we do a long period of editing, which some presses don't do quite so much. Sometimes the manuscript comes kind of fully formed and gets published pretty much straight away, whereas we do a lot of kind of editing probably over something like a 4 or 5 month period, actually, sort of quite close, meeting, you know, once, twice, maybe once a week, I suppose, a couple of times, and then towards the end it gets obviously quite intense. We just had that period because we just published 3 new ones, so there's that sort of long period where we kind of work with the poet to kind of develop the work, and sometimes we ask people to submit, say, 6 to 10 poems to kick off with, and then we go into their sort of what else they've got, and sometimes we end up looking at maybe 30 poems and then scaling it right down to something like, you know, 20-ish. What's your editing process like, Kim? Is it similar to that, or do you have a different?
The 2 pamphlets the 2 poetry that we accepted this year were from writers that were a little bit more established. So we had so because of that, and because the manuscripts came in basically fully formed, we had a 2-step editing process where I went in, put everything into a Google Doc, and basically annotated the whole document. They had a week to review it, to comment, to make any corrections if it was just a spelling error or something that they completely agreed with to begin. There was some conversations over that time, and then we basically sat down for a really a good 2-hour meeting to get that document to the point where it was clean. When I've had work come in for, say, a micro chapbook where I felt it needed a little bit more time, I did one editing round kind of several months ago, that was in that kind of Google Doc format, and then I went and did another one, and then we've had a meeting and we've got to a clean document, and that's kind of where I want to get to, where there is a when stuff is coming in more or less There's not going to be major structural edits. It's a case of getting to a point where there's a master document within a kind of shortish period. But I obviously, if we're working with more debuts or there's something that I want to, it would be a bit of a longer process. But I think it would be in those kinds of rounds.
So that's actually really intense. There's these really intense windows where you really sort of zoom in and look at it. That must be fun.
I think with the way that I work on the press, because I tend to put 1 day a week into the press solidly, the intense work makes much more sense for me. And then obviously I moved around my schedule a little bit for Nina, because Nina Murray is also a diplomat currently stationed in Kiev. So that obviously comes first. So there is flexibility there. But when a poet can make that, I'm happy to do that too,
This is great. You're giving us a real sense of, the broad range of poetry. We've had plumbers, we've got diplomats.
Yeah.
Anybody, this is the thing, anybody can write a poem, really. Anybody can put together a pamphlet, potentially, if they've got the craft behind it. Can we just turn a couple of final things we want to look at? Can we just turn to the micro publication? So you have the kind of micro press and the micro pamphlet. What makes the oh, you got one?
I've got two. Hold on, give me a moment.
No, that's fine. I'll just keep asking.
Just reaching.
What makes the micro? What makes them micro, and why do micro rather? I mean, the pamphlet is already quite small. What makes them even more micro? And why into a micro?
I like micros because I think they very much speak to that zine culture, and they very much speak to the indie kind of space. And there's when you're working in indie press, you're not doing it to make a profit. I mean, the Bragg is a community interest company anyway. Like, I'm not taking profit out of that business. Everything goes back. So this is one of our micros. We've got lovely rose gold shimmery end papers. This is a tiny little prose short story. And then we've got this with the handmade end papers. You can see there's a little bit of variation in that. And then you've got some prose, some poetry here, sorry. So I kind of really fell in love with the idea when I had a broken sleep legitimate snack accepted for publication. I loved the process. I loved the fact that after a really long string of no's for me, it was the first yes that really helped me get my foot in the door. So I think they're really wonderful for writers that are just starting out. And even pamphlets are deeply, deeply competitive. So this is another avenue. And I think there is something about the limited edition of them, the handmadeness, I'm sure there's a better word than that, the handcraftedness of them. And this one's by Liv Aldridge, who is an up-and-coming writer. She's really brilliant, very much in the vein of Salima Hill, which is really quite lovely. So it's nice to be able to do that discovering through the micros, and also to work with writers that I wouldn't get a chance to otherwise. Again, my micros are open worldwide. And we published Amelia K. And this is a short story about from the perspective of a haunted house. But it's really about intergenerational trauma and ingrained poverty in the US through the medium of a haunted house, which I thought was just exquisite. And it's, lets us put in archival illustrations. Basically, they're fun. They're really fun. And I think that sometimes maybe there should be more fun in publishing.
That looks great. Those are fantastic. I'm going to go. Are there still those available?
Those are both
They're
gone, but we will have some more coming out in May, so very, very soon.
Right.
And if anyone is very, very interested and would like a digital copy, I can do some sending out. And I handcraft these with my printer, going slightly insane. I do all the cutting to size, all the stamping. We've got a little gold stamp on this one. You can just see it.
That's a different kind of commitment, isn't it, to the sort of editing commitment? And you were mentioning kind of one of the things which people might be interested in is kind of submissions, so how people submit. We've just recently, for the last three that we just published, and the launch actually is as a physical launch in London on Monday, and then on the 7th of May we're doing a digital launch. But that was the first time we'd done an open submissions window. Previously we'd kind of scouted around and looked for poets ourselves. But how do you work it, Kim? Do you have a pamphlet submission window? Do you have a different submission window for micros, a different one, obviously, for the micro journal as well?
So the micro journal opens quarterly. It opens for 1 month. The months it opens are available on the website. So if you go either to thebrag.co and click through, or you can go to carmenera.com. Sorry, it's carmenera.com, because otherwise it looks like Carmen Terror, which is not really the vibe we wanted. So that's all just on there. Really simple. We're open when we're open. When we're not, read us. And for everything else, we open once a year in the summer for 6 weeks. I could go and split it all up, but I think honestly, I'm very happy to consider both a pamphlet and a micro chapbook, pamphlet, whatever you want to call them, a micro from people. I just like them to say what they're submitting, so I know going in. So they can just submit one of each. And actually Sarah Westcott submitted as a micro and as a pamphlet. And I wanted the pamphlet, so I took the pamphlet, and it made sense. So there is that. And we also opened for prose pamphlets during that time, but you've got to pick prose or poetry. You can have a micro as well, but I'm not considering 3 at once. There is a limit to the amount of work I can do. And basically we just do a lot of we try and do a lot of getting the word out ahead of it. I've been doing that at the Free Verse Fair here, just anywhere I can, because I love working with new writers. I'm really excited to see what we discover. And then I have a lovely dedicated team of first readers. I normally first read everything myself, but where it becomes overwhelming, some people work with the Brag, so that's actually the other authors here, Finlay Waralo and Nathaniel Spain, who are both Northern, and have Nathaniel used to work for the Poetry Book Society. Finlay's a member of the writing squad, so they've got really great qualifications for coming and giving me a hand, and that's how they work. And we get together, we're reading everything, and last year we got our answers in by the middle of August, after closing at the beginning of August. So we do tend to try and power through them within about a month or so.
That is deeply impressive. That's very fast. I mean, you think about some other magazines who turn these things around in several months later, maybe a year later, and presses as well. And I think you're drawing attention very neatly there to that kind of sense of the collaborative nature of it. And there's a little community there that have those readers, and also it's very it is sometimes somebody's kitchen table. That's where this
very much so.
From, right? Yeah. Could you mention the kind of northern writers, or they're based in the north? How does the Brag kind of fit into a kind of, I don't know, a broader context of a kind of the cultural industry or other industries? How do you feel yourself sort of fitting into a kind of northern community of maybe publishers and art organizations?
So I think there is very much a set of community of creative communities in the north. There's places like Butcher's Dog, New Writing North, the Lit and Phil Library, where there's a lot of culture going on in the north, but there's not necessarily a lot of, say, pamphlet publishers. Particularly, there's not a lot of engagement with weird fiction or genre fiction. There is some. I'm not the only one out there, but I saw a bit of a gap, and I was like, cool, you guys, Butcher's Dog gets all that beautiful ecological stuff, and we do a little bit of that, but I'm also like, you know what, I'm here for the weirdness. We just our last issue of Carmen Era was all about messed up, slightly evil children, like going missing on the moors, changelings, babies that are crocodiles. That was the vibe. So I'm aware that we like to do things that are a bit odd, and I think that that gives us a nice character within the culture industry. So they go, oh, you're writing a bit odd, or you're writing about folklore. Oh, go to Kim, right? That's where I'd like to be. Oh, and we save spots. We save a single spot for a northern writer in Carmina Era every single time. Obviously, it's not like if we have one northern, we won't do any more. It's just that it has to be one northern writer at least. And I'm really encouraging northern writers to get in touch over the submissions because it would be great to because yeah, we'd like to help more writers in the north. Like I said, I don't think there's a huge set of pamphlet publishers, and we're not exclusive. You know, we work with people from all over, but it's nice. I think it's nice for writers who are emerging in the north to know that the press kind of on their side.
Absolutely, that very much speaks to that sense of kind of community, doesn't it, as well? That's great. Yeah, you've really got a wonderful ecosystem kind of going on there, haven't you? I mean, it's quite interesting for us. I don't know, Claire, if you have any thoughts on this, but being in Oxford, where there is a lot of stuff kind of happening culturally, but sometimes that is sort of a little bit isolating. So some of that is based at Oxford University, and we're at Oxford Brookes, so we're different university, but there's a lot happening down in the city. And we're up a little hill. And sometimes there is a kind of sense in which those two universities are quite divorced from each other, really. Sometimes there's collaboration, but quite oftentimes there isn't, particularly maybe in artistic terms. And maybe there is a sense that there's a lot happening somewhere else, and sometimes those pockets that are kind of separate from each other isn't a huge amount of kind of crossover. So it is quite interesting thinking about our kind of status as a press. Claire, do you have any thoughts about kind of how we fit into kind of Oxford and the artistic community?
I think that the walls of the university are quite intimidating, inside and out, frankly. So I think we might have to try extra hard to get out and about, to be on the other side of what are perceived to be the walls, the ivory tower, the whatever it is. So I think it's really important that we do things like appear in free verse and look like human beings, and so maybe we have to try a little bit extra to get over that. I don't know. I'm just guessing, because we're fairly convivial animals anyway, really. But it may be that there's that double branding that we've got to get over in a way, I guess.
No, it's a good point you make. I think there's obviously a lot going on in the local community artistically as well. It's not obviously just exclusive to the universities. Let me pick up this question from Marge about so Marge writes, is the pamphlet as a chapbook often is in the US a stepping stone toward full-length publication, by which I mean the poet doesn't necessarily assemble a body of work perfectly small and contained for a chapbook, but puts together enough to fill a chapbook in order to get a foot into the national poetry community. I ask in part because chapbooks end up costing nearly the same as a full-length book, and maybe why they don't sell well. I personally would rather wait for the full-length book, which would usually contain some of those same poems. That's a really interesting question. Thank you very much. Kim, you any thoughts on that one?
I think that it's become so competitive to get a pamphlet out there in the first place now that it is very rare that poets are just kind of going, okay, 20, let's go. Basically, the pamphlets I picked up were really, really tightly themed. Sarah Westcott's already published full-length collections and won awards for those, and came back to us to do just a themed pamphlet that she felt was a strong idea on its own, just to stand as that little entity. I appreciate that pamphlets aren't necessarily the most cost-effective method of poetry, but I also think they are one of the freest, and obviously one of the I tend to find that I often prefer where my money is going when I'm buying a pamphlet directly from a publisher. I and also just as a writer, I've brought out, depending on how you want to see it, 3 or 4 pamphlets now, and none of that work is going into a collection bar about one poem. So I think they're definitely worth engaging with, even if you engage via the secondhand market, even if you engage by just keeping an eye on what's coming out, or you're very selective about what you buy within the pamphlet market. But I really do think that they're a different object doing different things in a collection. And I think that poets who then just shove their pamphlet into a collection, normally the reviews reflect that has been done, I would say. because I've seen people's opinions when poets have just kind of gone wholesale and moved. We've noticed is that.
Yes, I think you're right. Thank you. I think we're pretty much out of time, but thank you very much for those questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks so much to everybody for coming along. It's really wonderful to have you all here. Really appreciate you coming along, and huge thanks to Kim and Claire for all of your insights. It's been great to see all those examples. If anybody has any questions at any time, feel free to email me. Thanks, Kim. Feel free to
Final
email
shout.
me. Very happy to talk to people about it. And thanks again to the fantastic creative industry team.